International Academy of Trial Lawyers podcast, The Rule of Law, The Academy Speaks. I'm Craig Peters, the president-elect of the Academy, and I'm your host. Today, we are celebrating Law Day, which occurs every May 1st and was established by President Dwight Eisenhower in 1958. Law Day is a moment to reflect on the role of courts, judges, and lawyers in upholding justice and assuring that no one is above the law. And it's a perfect opportunity to discuss and celebrate the rule of law, to remind us that our rights, freedoms, and democracy ultimately depend on the rule of law. And I can think of no better person to have on the podcast to discuss Law Day and the rule of law than our guest, Judge Philip Pro. Judge Pro was a federal district judge for the District of Nevada and served in that role for almost 3 decades. And since he retired from the bench in 2015, has been involved in numerous organizations advocating for the rule of law, both here in the United States as well as abroad. Welcome, Judge Pro. Good to have you.
Thank you. Good to be with you, Craig.
So I want to start this podcast by talking with you about the system that we have, the rule of law, and why it's important not only that the system is fair, but that it also appears fair, and what can be done to ensure that the public thinks that our system is fair. Can you talk a little bit about that from your perspective as a person who sat as a judge and now lectures on this issue of the rule of law?
Oh, yeah, I'd be glad to tackle that. And I think it's an ideal question to begin a discussion when we talk about Law Day and the dream of the theme that they have for the dream of a justice system that functions. I think it links the citizens to the Constitution, which is where we derive the rule of law in our democratic system. And the belief that the people have is critically important. I mean, we may think as lawyers and judges that we're delivering a fair resolution of a dispute that is in accord with the applicable law in the case, and that the parties have been given all of their due process rights and equal protection of the law and so forth. But we're very close to it, and we're preaching to the choir when we do that. Perhaps when we talk about the litigants, now those are citizens, obviously, corporate and real, they also experience it, and courts resolve disputes. That's what we do. That's our function. And that means there's a winner and there's a loser. And the loser perhaps feels not as happy about that as the person who prevails in a case. And they may have a different view as to the fairness of the process based solely on the result, not on the way in which it is derived. But most people don't have that kind of contact with the justice system unless they maybe serve as a juror, or they have occasion to have an interest in some case personally or through others. And so they absorb information about the legal system, the justice system, through media, social media, word of mouth, many different ways. And it's important that we convey to the public the fact that the system is working. I think in direct response to your question, the best thing we can do as lawyers and judges is to in fact deliver a fair resolution of every dispute to the best of our ability that comes before us, according to the law that applies in the case, not putting anybody above the law. No one is above the law. That's fundamental to the rule of law. Those who govern are also subject to it. But it extends beyond just the way an individual case is decided. It also talks about respect for the law by the members or the participants and official officers in government. And so I think under the current attacks we see going on against the judiciary and the justice system in some sectors of our government today, it's particularly important that we speak out and make the justice system accessible to people, make people more aware of it, and do what we can to to communicate how we operate.
Yeah, there's almost some structural challenges, it seems to me, that we have with advocating on behalf of our justice system, the rule of law, particularly for some of our participants. You know well as a judge, if you get attacked as a judge by somebody and accused of being unfair or biased or making a bad ruling, what have you, there are limitations placed on you in order to try to preserve the both the appearance as well as the reality of impartiality from having you respond. Um, we have things like, you know, a president and a governor who are able to issue pardons after our system has already executed its functions to come to a decision to then change those decisions. So we've got kind of all of these things that compete with people's hope that the system is fair that seem like they can undermine it. How do we solve that? We're in a new world. We're in a very media forward kind of world. Do we need to start showcasing more of what's happening in courtrooms through social media so that people can actually see it? Do we need to change the rules so that judges are better able to respond when they get attacked? Do we need to change the way our pardon system? Tell me your thoughts about this, because I know these are things that you think about in
Sure.
terms of how we preserve the appearance for folks.
Well, you put your finger on an issue that motivated me and several of my retired colleagues to come together and form what's called the Article 3 Coalition. That's a group of more than 50, we're nearly 60 members, retired Article 3 judges who really felt it their responsibility to step up and advocate for their colleagues that are still hearing cases on the federal bench who are restricted from speaking out themselves and defending decisions they make or commenting on those, because it's very important that their neutrality be preserved. Federal judges under Article 3 of the Constitution enjoy something called judicial independence. That means that they should be able to make their decisions based upon the facts and the law that applies in the case without outside interference, without a popularity contest, without a referendum on how they should decide the case, without pressure from elected governmental officials in the legislative or executive branch or media pressure, things of that sort. And Justice Anthony Kennedy had a great way to address that. He said that the judges are conferred with judicial independence not to enable them to do anything they want, but to enable them to do what they must, and that is they must follow the law. So it's incumbent upon those of us who can to speak up. It's also, I think, incumbent upon members of the bar, lawyers, to speak up. Lawyers themselves have been under attack for representing interests that are unpopular with certain positions by people in a particular administration or governmental office. Disagreement is fine. There's no judges are not above being criticized for a ruling they have made. In fact, that's healthy. That contributes to a robust debate in the public space, and may lead to positive things like amendments in statutes or theoretically even an amendment to the Constitution. But uh, the problem that we have is that we don't have a very good ability to compete with all of the media that exists out there. And I think fundamentally we have to keep our eye on the ball, do our jobs, let the process play out, make the best decision that a judge can make based upon the evidence before them and the law that they find applies, subject that to appeal before a court of appeals and ultimately before a Supreme Court, if that's appropriate in the case, to get a final resolution. I don't think even the attacks that we see lately in the last 18 months or so are going to dissuade any judges I know from doing their job and calling the cases as they think they should be called. But it can upset or disturb the public's understanding and shake their confidence. And there's a real danger in that because judges don't have an army, they don't have the ability to enforce their rulings. They have certain powers, sanctions, contempt authority, things of that sort, but they can't marshal somebody to make somebody comply with a ruling that they have made if they're just not going to do it. And there are different avenues that can be used, but you mentioned the pardons. The pardons exist, but that's also part of the law. There's a presidential pardon power. There's nothing that a judge could do about that once the decision is made by someone who has pardon authority. But it goes back to the very beginnings, our founding documents. You know, when Benjamin Franklin left the Constitutional Convention, a woman named Mrs. Powell came up to him and said, "Well, Dr. Franklin, what do we have? Do we have a monarchy or do we have a republic?" And he responded to her, "Madam, we have a republic if you can keep it." That Constitution is not. There was a political science professor years ago. I think he might have been from Canada, but Michael Kamen. He wrote a book about a machine that would go of itself. And basically, he was saying, you know, the Constitution's not a perpetual motion machine that will go of itself. It requires the energy, the fuel of an engaged, energetic citizenry to make it work. And the people are the ones, we the people in the preamble, we established the Constitution. The people ultimately have control and they can exercise their voice in so many ways. Voting, serving on juries, many, many ways to becoming engaged that can bring about change where they think it's necessary. And sometimes that's what it takes to correct some of these difficult areas.
Do you think that there is some role to be played in acknowledging, that our system is not perfect and that it is constantly a work in progress? It sort of feels to me sometimes when I hear the criticisms that there is an impression by the public that we are just forever stuck in the system that we have, that that pardons just exist, and because they're part of the Constitution, and so therefore they're legal, as opposed to saying, okay, but is that a good idea? Should we rethink that? What are the mechanisms by which we could change that? And would change be good? I wonder if a more robust discussion and perhaps even a more honest, not that anybody's being dishonest, but I think it tends to get, when we talk about the rule of law, we focus on what's important and sometimes can gloss over those parts that are of concern to people. And in some cases, I think with good reason. A good example, you had ethical obligations that you were expected to live by as a federal judge, that the Supreme Court justices, the U.S. Supreme Court, does not have to live by.
Right.
There are people who are genuinely concerned about that. I think the legal community is genuinely concerned about that. And I think instead of shying away from that because it might feel like politics, perhaps we need to run towards that more. Retired judges, I think that's an area that sitting judges, quite frankly, could actually take a stand on, because it's a position that says ethics are important. I can't imagine how that could be a conflict for them to say that that is important to them as a sitting judge, because almost all of them, except for those folks in DC, those limited number of folks in DC who sit on the Supreme Court, have to abide by. So, I mean, talk to us about that. Like, have you thought about how we might be more proactive in actually talking about and helping people to get involved in being change agents?
I think you raise an awfully good point, and maybe I can neutralize a little bit of the image that we aren't active. We actually are, as a judiciary, quite active. But first of all, more fundamentally, our Constitution has been amended several times. It's a difficult process. Legislative changes have been enacted that make changes. And that's why I mentioned earlier that we're not immune from criticism and discussion. We may make rulings based upon the law, and that law doesn't make sense even to me when I'm making a ruling, or it's not the way I would have carved it out. But I don't have fiat to rewrite the law because Phil Pro doesn't like the way that law, works. We have to follow it. There's definitely a role for the courts as well to go right at that. We do that. We have a very refined structure of court governance within the Judicial Conference of the United States, the circuit councils, the district conferences within each of the 94 federal districts that address rules changes, for example, or entire mechanisms, creation of the magistrate judges system, working with the Congress to create an adjunct to the U.S. District Court that has served us well since 1968. Many times we have done that. It maybe not in a overtly public way, but definitely changes made in response to public criticisms. But yes, I think we need to acknowledge, warts and all, when there's an issue. When I've had occasion, and since we're speaking to the International Academy, this may resonate with you. I've participated in rule of law type programs in more than 20 countries since 1998. And
Hungary, by the way, right?
Pardon me?
I think wasn't one of the places you did that was in Hungary?
Hungary was one of the first places that I did. A former law clerk that asked me to come over to Hungary, and but it just a huge number. And these were countries, many of them, in which the rule of law was non-existent. And if anybody wants to have an appreciation for the importance of the rule of law in a judicial system, justice system, they have only to visit countries where there is no independent judiciary, where there may be lip service given and principles stated about following the law or rule of law, but where the reality is the judges are not independent. The Ministry of Justice, meaning the executive branch, controls the outcome of cases. And this is something that is fundamentally difficult for these countries to deal with, not only from an individual right standpoint, but economic rights. We often talk about the rule of law as it affects a criminal case, for example, or a case involving human rights. Terribly important, critically important. But equally important is that all of the cases that involve contract disputes and the ability to enforce contracts that involve a host of other business types of issues, financial issues that are fundamental to economic rights of the citizens, real and corporate, and the economy of a country.
They've done these studies that show that the countries that have the stronger the rule of law, the more investment they get and the stronger the economy gets. There's a direct correlation between the two.
Yeah, I'm from Nevada. There's right next to Las Vegas, there's a very large dam, Hoover Dam, that blocks the Colorado River. That was built 90 years ago, and it still looks new. You go into that, it's a marvel, an engineering marvel, and a magnificent structure. And for example, I was in Tbilisi, Georgia, and I had a picture of it with me, and I was explaining to the judges I was talking with, if I build dams in Nevada and I'm contracted to come to Tbilisi and build a river on the major river that runs through the middle of Tbilisi, and there's a problem with the contract, and I get into litigation in the Georgian courts, and I get homered. I don't get a ruling that the law calls for or the contract calls for. I would explain to them, I'm not going to build dams in your country anymore. I'm not going to invest in your country. You're not going to be a participant in the world economy in the same way you could be if you had a viable justice system.
Yeah. Well, and I want to go back for just a minute to the point about, the systems that do exist within, particularly with your bailiwick being a judge, and knowing that there are these systems that the sitting judges have where processes can be improved, can be discussed, and ultimately do provide huge benefits for the court system. I sit on the Judicial Council here in California as one of 4 attorney members.
Yeah.
And I was shocked to see the volume, both the volume and the diligence of the work that is done that helps our system get better all the time. And so I think, maybe as we're thinking about this moving forward, how do we help the public know that this system is a work in progress, but that there are lots of people trying to make it better publicity about what is happening in those organizations at the federal level, at the local level, at the state levels, and maybe leaning in a little bit more to social media and trying to be, a lot of what we do is not terribly sexy or interesting, right? It's not attention grabbing, but particularly with good lawyers, you were a very good lawyer before you got on the bench. I'm sure that was in part why they selected you to be on the federal bench. We can be creative about how we promote those things that we're doing so that maybe they do feel more interesting to folks, we get more eyeballs on it, and build out more confidence in the system.
Well, you're doing that with the podcast like this. That's a public information asset that goes out. But when I speak to on this subject to bar groups, the very first time I did this when I joined Article A3C was the local bar association in Clark County, Nevada. And I had an array of about 300 or 400 lawyers in the room. And I said, look, I'm preaching to the choir. There's not a one of you who would raise your hand and say, I think the rule of law is a terrible idea. It's you just have people that are with you on those subjects and do have a deep understanding of it. But I said, you've all got many communities. You have, as I do, a responsibility to carry that message to your many communities. Could be a social, business community, religious community, political community, whatever communities that you have within your family and your neighbors and such, and also to promote civic education in our schools. You can do that and participate in programs that are structured, but you can also, if you're a member of clubs, speak to senior citizens groups, other groups to educate people, because you're right, they're probably not going to take the time to dig deep and come down to a courthouse to watch court proceedings or try to educate themselves. And frankly, what they get on social media oftentimes, or in even the normal media, is not necessarily accurate and certainly not complete. It's bad news is good news for the media. So it's not going to be the kinds of things that maybe would be educational and help someone learn.
Well, Judge Pro, on that call to action for all of us to do everything that we can within our power and within our own groups, both inside and outside of the law, we're going to call it a wrap. And we really appreciate you being with us today, and helping us to celebrate Law Day and think more about the rule of law and how we can more effectively protect the rule of law and the independence of our judiciary. To all of our listeners, thanks for listening and watching. You can listen and subscribe to us on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And we look forward to seeing you at our next podcast. Thanks again, Judge Pro.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it very much.